And I'm very pleased to be chairing this next session. Jim, who is still with us, has set an important agenda for transforming the R&D and business model of our system. In this session, I think we're going to come in a bit to sort of define the problems that we have to solve and hopefully point the way to some potential solutions. As you see here, the session will feature Dr. Pedro Noguera, who is Distinguished Professor of Education here at UCLA's Graduate School of Education and Information Studies. His research focuses on how schools are influenced by social and economic conditions as well as by demographic trends. He's a prolific author, serves on the boards of numerous national and local organizations, appears as a regular commentary. You may have seen him on outlets such as CNN, MSNBC, and NPR. So we're glad to have him here, and he's received more awards than I could possibly say here. Dr. Debra Duardo recently assumed the position of Superintendent of Schools for Los Angeles County Office of Education. She spent her prior career at Los Angeles Unified School District, where she was most recently Director of Health and Human Services Division. She has a very interesting background. I hope it's okay to share. She herself was a high school dropout who then went on to our alma mater here, UCLA, to get her bachelor's, her master's, and her doctorate. Her background actually is in social work. So she brings a very interesting perspective, I think, to the panel. You've already met Jim Shelton and probably have picked up that in addition to chairing or being president of the Chan Zuckerberg Education Initiative, he represents the worlds of technology, entrepreneurship, venture capital, as well as having prior experience in the U.S. Department of Education and in many other worlds as well. Each of our speakers deserves a much more detailed introduction than I've given them, but I'm going to leave it there in the interests of our time for conversation. So in the session today, I'm going to lead out by providing some context on the nature of the problem we need to solve and where we're starting in terms of student performance, as well as some of the resources we have for moving forward. Then Pedro will lead off with a presentation on how he sees the world moving forward and how we can help schools change. After Pedro's presentation, we'll convene a panel to discuss Pedro's ideas and others that may be important to finding important pathways forward. So we'll start as a conversation between us as a panel and then involve you in the larger conversation. So be thinking of your questions so that you can join the conversation. So let's start with context. I want to make three major points. Number one, what kids need to know and be able to do has changed dramatically since I went to school, and perhaps even since many of you went to school. Secondly, despite the fact that we need kids and schools to help them acquire a much broader and deeper array of knowledge and skills, kids are struggling in achieving the most basic academic skills today. And thirdly, we're at a critical juncture point with a new Every Child Succeeds Act and with the capabilities we've developed through research, through the wisdom of practice, as represented in the room today. So it's time, as Jim said, to take the problem by the horns and move forward in new ways. So, what do kids need for success? Consider what's happening in this country politically, economically, socially. What are the capabilities that kids will need? I'm tempted to talk about the current political landscape and what it possibly says about our citizenry's ability to think critically, to use evidence to distinguish fact from fiction. But that's too controversial, so instead, I'll move to the economic argument, which seems to be supported from all sides of the aisle. It's clear that technology, the same technology that gives us greater capability to deal with today's problems, is also changing the nature of work. We've known for some time that technology is replacing jobs that requires procedural skills, because machines can do it. And as we move forward, technology is replacing skills higher and higher up the skills sophistication domain. David Deming recently showed that the jobs that are growing and that draw the highest salaries are those that involve both technical and social skills. So cognitive skills alone are not sufficient. Meanwhile, business survey after business survey over the last decade have indicated what employers are looking for. They're looking not only for employees who can think critically, can be innovative, can solve problems. They're looking for employees who can communicate, who can collaborate, work in teams, who are culturally sensitive and the like, and of course, who will show up on time and be persistent. Some call these broader array of skills 21st century skills, although clearly they were the skills we all needed for success in the 20th century. Others call them soft skills or non-cognitive skills. The National Research Council, in its deliberations and report on education for life and work, defined these skills in 3 interrelated broad domains. Cognitive skills, such as innovation, critical thinking, problem solving. Interpersonal skills, such as communication, collaboration, cultural sensitivity, and intrapersonal skills, such as persistence, grit, and the like. Whatever we call them, it's clear that they're needed for student success in the future and for our country's success in the future. So, schools and kids need to be responsible for acquiring a much broader and deeper set of competencies. But at the same time, as I mentioned, kids are struggling to achieve even basic academic competency. Look, for example, at NAEP, where in the most recent and first assessment of technology and engineering literacy, 8th graders, only 43% of 8th graders tested proficient in that domain. In NAEP reading, most recently, barely 1/3 of kids tested proficient. That's pretty depressing, if I may say so. When we look internationally at how the US is doing, particularly on PISA, the program for international student assessment, the US has fallen to the middle of the pack. We're not top of the world. We were supposed to be first in the world in 2000, by the Goals 2000 committee way back when. We've not made it. Given that students are not performing very well K-12, it should also come as no surprise that kids are not entering college prepared for college work. The estimates vary by state and by type of institution, but let me give you one recent example out of California. CSU California State University, Sacramento estimated that 53% of its entering freshmen last year needed remedial work in English, math, or both. College graduation rates also give pause. Based on OECD data, the US has moved from first in the world to the middle of the pack, from first to 14th place among the 37 OECD nations. To give you a sense of the concrete meaning of this, on average, among all full-time students who first entered four-year institutions in 2008, only 60% had completed a college degree within 6 years. It's more dismal still in two-year institutions. In 2011, only 28% had created a degree or certificate within 150% of the expected time. These circumstances, of course, were the rationale for what were the new Common Core state standards, which now have been variously morphed into various college and career-ready standards, and the call for new assessments. And of course, on these assessments, kids are not doing very well either. So the overall performance is bad enough, but when one looks behind overall performance and looks at the achievement gap, the news becomes more disturbing still. In 1915, that really was a while ago. In 2015, the percentages of subgroups performing at or above proficient in grade 4 reading range from 18% proficient for African American students to 57% proficient for Asian students. The situation was very similar at the 8th grade. As I just mentioned, on average, about 60% of four-year students entering in 2008 had completed degrees 6 years later. However, completion rates were lower for Blacks at about 41%, Hispanics about 53%, and American Indians close to 40%. Then for whites, 63% graduated, and Asians more than 70%. And you see these gaps on every indicator available in education. For example, overall, 43% of California high school grads have taken and passed the coursework required for UC or CSU admissions with at least a C, which of course would not get them into those institutions, but at least they've taken the coursework. The overall, as I said, 43% of California students have taken and passed the coursework. The percentage of disadvantaged students who make this benchmark is just above a third, far below their economically advantaged peers. And it should come as no great surprise that English learners have a tough time taking and passing these courses since they have to learn English while they're trying to master content. And less than 10% of English learners hit this benchmark. Given these enduring gaps, it's worth noting how the demographics of the school-age population have changed in the last decades. NAEP long-term trends indicate that in 1978, 80% of the student population was white. Based on the 2012 assessment, 56% of the student population is white. Big differences also occur in the percentage of students living in poverty. Consider, for example, the current school-age population in California, which is now majority minority. Hispanics make up nearly 50% of the population. Asian and Black students account for about 11% and 7% respectively. More than 1 in 5 students are English learners. Importantly, nearly 60% qualify for free or reduced lunch. That's an enormous percentage that brings with it enormous challenges, particularly in light of the cycle of underachievement that poverty can breed. We saw before the gaps in educational achievement. This lower educational achievement is associated with lower future income, higher rates of imprisonment, and a host of other negative outcomes, including less access to quality teachers, unmet basic needs, family mobility, inadequate medical and dental care, mental health issues, drug and alcohol abuse, crime, violence, and so I wanted to add a little bit of complexity to the transformation. Okay, we'll come back to that. Glad you noticed. This is pretty bad. All of these things are things that impede student learning and impede our ability to get to the dramatic effect sizes that we need to get to. Family engagement in schools, which we know is important for kids' learning, also suffers. Income inequality likely is fueling the issue. But schools need to be sensitive, even though they cannot be fully responsible for changing the income inequality. They need to be sensitive to the kids who are in our schools, and we need to find effective solutions for them. The policy context, the new ESSA provides states and local districts the opportunity to change the way they do things. The question will be whether they have the capacity to do so and how we can help them do so. We see a broadened accountability framework that finally shows or recognizes that school success is more than academic indicators, that we need to be dealing with the whole child and considering a broader array of indicators about school climate and how kids are operating in schools. There's lots of attention to stakeholder engagement, reporting and communication, recommending that, it's going to take us all to reach success for kids, and everyone needs to be involved. So there are some bright spots. We saw last week minor progress on the economic front, slightly fewer kids, families in poverty. At least it's going in the right direction. We saw a minor narrowing of the gap at school entry for kindergarten kids, the gap between where kids from advantaged backgrounds enter and where poor kids enter. As Jim mentioned, we have an accumulating research base. If we could just figure out how to marshal it and marshal it across all of our expertise. We have represented in this room the wisdom of practice. We need to bring the wisdom of practice together with our research findings. And of course, we've got a lot of technology expertise in this room to help us pave the way. So I am going to second what Jim said, is how do we bring it all together in new combinations so that we can really make progress on where we need to go. Before I turn it over to Pedro, I'm going to just encourage you to think about questions or issues as he's talking that you want to raise. I will not seed you with questions, but I will turn it over to Pedro to start us on this challenging journey.
Thanks, Joan. Good morning.
Good morning.
It's great to be here. I want to thank CRESST for the invitation. Thank all of you for coming. I want to use this as an opportunity to reframe, to really pick up on where Joan left off by starting by saying that the most pressing issue facing American education today is inequality, okay, period. The achievement gap that we claim to have been so concerned about is really nothing more than an educational manifestation of social inequality. We are one of few countries in the world that, by law, in many states, though Connecticut now is holding out as an exception, spends less money on the children with the greatest needs than the most privileged. Money matters. I was disappointed by the chart Joan started with, which talked about what kids need, because it didn't mention health. It didn't mention the things she said at the end. And so for those of you who are thinking about engaging in reform, if you're not field testing your products in real schools with real kids, then chances are what you're selling is worthless. I'll give you an example. Some of you recall LA Unified invested $1 billion it didn't have in iPads. Didn't think that maybe they should train teachers first on how to use them or make sure kids couldn't get on Facebook in school while they had those iPads. Coachella Valley did the same thing. Right? When they asked the kids what they think of the iPads, the kids said, why don't you get us air conditioning for the bus? It's 120 degrees out here. Right? We're focused on the wrong things. We keep thinking there's a silver bullet solution, and we ignore the most basic needs of our kids. Right? We literally have kids who are hungry in American schools. We literally have kids who are sick with asthma, going to schools that have, they're just deplorable conditions. And all you have to do is go there and you see right away, this school is not fit for learning. Right? We've raised standards, but we haven't thought at all about what does it take to make those standards accessible to a range of kids in the schools we have right now. You know, I was thinking about it this morning at about 4 a.m. You know, we have seismic safety standards, which we should in California, right? If this building were to collapse on us, would we be punished further, right, if we survived? Right now, the state sets standards. We hold the kids accountable for the inability of the state to meet those standards. And we'll then threaten teachers with their jobs and principals, even though the state hasn't even made sure that the schools are equipped with what they need to meet the standards. We don't treat standards like that in any other field. We don't treat it like that for highways or for airports or for food and drugs. Only in education do we hold those who are the consumers responsible for the standards. It's backwards. So I would say there's so much we haven't done. And I think what I'd like to do today is to say that we could, in fact, make much more progress than we are. I was contacted 2 weeks ago when the latest results of the state exams came out about the ongoing disparities, and the reporter from the Chronicle asked me to explain it. I said, you know, you're asking the wrong question. We've known since 1966, when Coleman issued his report, that the backgrounds of the kids were driving the outcomes. Is that news? It's not news. Right? That the strongest predictor of how well a child will do in school is family income combined with parent education, especially the education of the mother. We've known that. Right? I said the question we should be asking is, where are we making progress despite the constraints? Because lo and behold, we are. And one of the things we don't do in education, and this is where policy has failed us, is to shine the light on the places where we're making progress and say, do more of that. You know? California's taken a step forward by doing equity-based funding. Great idea. Except it hasn't given districts guidance. Invest in these strategies. They help. Right? So I want to spend my time on that. I think, as I said, if we're really focused on advancing education in America, we should be because our future depends on it, we've got to make equity more central. Equity is about meeting the needs, the social needs and the academic needs of kids, because you can't separate them. Right? You can't separate the academic needs from physical needs, from emotional and psychological needs. So it's all occurring in the same person. At the same time, we have to make sure that all kids have access to what now is being called in the field deeper learning. Because those are, in fact, the kinds of skills that help a person be ready for college and for careers of the 21st century. What does that include? It includes the opportunity to utilize higher order thinking skills, to analyze, evaluate, apply, engage in some creativity, to undertake and learn complex tasks and challenging text, to acquire skills needed for college, independent research, critical analytical thinking, and to produce high-quality work that serves reflection of what you can do. This is what the Common Core calls for. One of the things I often ask is, for all those who are opposed to the Common Core, I say, what part are you opposed to? Right? What part are you opposed to? Right? It's not prescriptive. Right? It's actually an equity measure, because it's saying we need to make that available to all kids now. Where we fall is in giving guidance on how to do that. Right? We know from the research what kinds of teaching strategies and learning opportunities result in the greatest acquisition of knowledge. Sadly is, most of those strategies are not easily testable. Right? And so when we use standardized testing as the primary basis for determining what kids have learned, what we end up is giving teachers the message that their job is to raise test scores, not to promote independent research, the kinds of skills we know are key for writing. Why is it that 30% of the kids who pass A through G are still in remedial courses? Well, they're not doing these kinds of things. Their test-taking skills have improved, but they can't write very well. And that includes many kids who've gotten 3s and 4s, because we teach them here at UCLA. And many of them can't write either. As I said, inequality makes this work hard. It makes it hard because we are unconfused. We don't know how to address these needs, and that's not surprising because we don't have the will to address them. Right? We are not tackling issues like hunger and asthma and housing issues. I mean, if you work in San Bernardino County, which had more foreclosures than any county in the United States, housing is an educational issue. Kids without stable homes can't get their homework done. Is this really, is this mind-boggling information here? What's mind-boggling to me is why isn't that right there at the priority list? If we're really serious about making sure kids from San Bernardino and Oakland and LA have the same chance as kids in Malibu, why aren't we focused on this? I'd say because our policies are based on slogans, not on a real reading of what's going on in our society and how to use education to advance opportunity. Robert Putnam wrote his book, Our Kids, right? If you haven't read it, please do. He goes back to Clinton, Ohio, where he grew up, and he asks, how is it possible that a town that once sent 80% of its kids to college, when he graduated in 1964, sends less than 20% now? What happened? Well, it's the picture of America. The homes facing Lake Erie are fine. Right? The other side of the tracks, devastation. No jobs, drug abuse, unemployment. The reason why Donald Trump is doing so well is because many Americans have lost access to that so-called American dream. And it takes more than a slogan to change that. So we've got to recognize that if we're going to make equity central, we're going to need a different strategy than we have right now. If we want to see those disparities closed, then simply raising the bar is not going to get us there. We've got to figure out how to get more kids, how to get it within reach, and do the things that it takes. We've always got to be focused on outcomes. This is not to suggest by any means that we have to wait till we end poverty to educate kids. There's absolutely no evidence at all that poor kids can't learn under the right conditions. But we haven't focused on the conditions. And blaming kids, blaming teachers, blaming schools, shutting them down is not a strategy for improvement. You want to see another strategy? Go to Canada. Those crazy Canadians, you know what they call their strategy? Capacity building. And when a school struggles, you know what they do? The Ministry of Education comes in and says, how can we help? Not who should we fire? It's a different strategy with different outcomes. And that's why they're way ahead of us, those crazy. They also think you can speak 2 languages in Canada, and it's not a problem. They don't pass English-only laws. access to high standards is an equity issue because we've traditionally reserved this for the kids we think are advanced and not for the kids we think are giftless, right? And that's also what we do with our teachers. In most districts, who gets the best teachers? The kids we think are capable of the most. The newest teachers, the least experienced teachers, they get the kids with the greatest needs. It's ongoing practice throughout the country in most places. We dumb down the curriculum to those we don't think are college material, so they're doing the rote memorization. You know, my good friend is looking for a preschool for her daughter. She would like to have her kid in the new de Blasio preschools, except they're doing regimentation, they're doing memorization. Right next door, a nice middle-class Montessori school, you know what they're doing? They're studying snails. And through the snails, they're learning vocabulary, they're learning about the biology and the ecology of their neighborhood. Which one do you think the kids like more? We confuse academic performance with actual ability and potential. So many of the kids that we're calling level 1s and level 2s, we don't even know we don't even know if they took the test seriously. Because we are not assessing for ability, for talent, we are assessing for how well you did on a test. And it's a huge problem there, because we don't know enough about these kids. And finally, we've given teachers very little guidance on how to work under these conditions. And not surprising, they're not staying. Why do we have a teacher shortage? Not because we have a shortage of teachers. We have a teacher shortage because we have a shortage of people willing to work under abysmal conditions. That's the shortage. We talk about the lack of research. What's the research on how to teach a class of 40 English learners who are in 8th grade and still don't speak English? What's the research show? Is there a best practice for that one? Right. We're asking the wrong questions. We need the research, but right now we have a big gap between research and practice, just as we have a big gap between policy and practice. And until we start to close those gaps, nothing will change. Why are schools so skeptical of entrepreneurs? Because everybody's selling them something. Everybody's selling the latest thing that will fix their problems, right? And we have no way of vetting and know who's a charlatan, what's real, what could really work in these schools. So we've got to ask different questions. And we've got to recognize that this kind of scripted teaching we're seeing in schools, the emphasis on the low-level skills, the limited opportunities to deeper learning are actually what's holding us back. So what should we be doing? I don't have time to talk about this in detail, but we should be focused on child development, right? Recognizing that much of what we've ignored, Jim Comer, you talk to Jim Comer, he's saying, you know what teachers don't get anymore? They don't understand what it means to do things that are developmentally appropriate for children. Right? We've got good research in neuroscience that all kids need to be stimulated and challenged, not just the most advanced. And we need to know much, much more about context. The way the context, the neighborhood, is impacting the school and what schools can do to respond. So I don't want to go into detail about the standards, but the standards, again, I think are very reasonable, make a lot of sense. Right? What they ask for kids to be able to do and what they give teachers the license to do, I think, is moving us in the right direction. Now the question becomes, where are we doing this right? Well, here's an example of a place that's been doing it right. Brockton High School in Massachusetts, the largest high school in the state with over 4,200 kids. One of 2 urban high schools in the state that gets a level 1 rating. What's their secret? When Boston and Springfield and Holyoke and Lawrence were doing test prep, because they were faced with the prospect that most of their kids would fail the state exams, and in Massachusetts, if you fail, you don't get a diploma. Brockton decided every teacher would become a teacher of literacy, regardless of the subject. So it's literacy across the curriculum. And for the last 6 years, over 1/3 of the senior class has gotten the highest possible score, which gives them a free scholarship to any public university. You know what Brockton is known for? Brockton is known for fighting. There's a boxer out front. Rocky Marciano came from Brockton. Marvin Hagler came from Brockton. If you Google 2 years ago, they had a big fight at the graduation. They're still fighting in Brockton. They didn't erase poverty, but now they got a great high school. And they're also known for writing in Brockton. because they have focused on meeting the needs of the kids. The math standards also make a lot of sense. They call for kids to apply what they've learned, and even though if Louis C.K. can't get it, doesn't mean that our teachers can't, with the bright guidance, right? And it calls for kids to be able to apply those concepts and procedures in different ways and for real-world challenges, to develop problem-solving skills and collaboration, all the things we know, the social skills that Joan alluded to. Here's an example of a school right here in East LA where, look at these kids. In a 90-minute algebra class, all these kids are Latino kids. All these kids are poor. Over half of them English learners. And they're up out of their seats learning math, which means they're also learning problem solving and collaboration and how to work together. And the teacher's so good, she can stand back and talk to me because she doesn't have to hover. In fact, what she really gets to do now is to differentiate support. She gets to move amongst them and see who needs help, who doesn't, who should stay late, and who's got it, who can help another one. Now, the sad thing about that school is right next door, the cemetery method was still going on. You know the cemetery method? Line them up in rows, keep them as still as possible. Because even in the same school, when you can find one example of highly effective teaching, right next door you can still find very traditional ineffective strategies. Because what we're not good at is helping people learn from each other and really making clear what good teaching looks like. I also like to point out to people, this is the highest form of classroom management because the kids are academically engaged. And guess what? This is, the standards call for the English learners to be able to get this. It calls for the students with learning disabilities to be able to get this. They get extra supports. They're supposed to. But we're not supposed to lower the standards for these kids, which I think is the right way to go. We don't help kids by dumbing it down and by making it easier. So then the question is, what does it take to get it right? Oh, well, there's the Bronx Academy of Language and Technology. There it is in the South Bronx. These students at this school are students with interrupted formal education. That means they were not attending school regularly in their home country. So most of them are not literate in their native language. The research shows that these kids, especially when they come to us at 14, have very low probability of ever graduating. Over 95% of these kids graduate in the South Bronx. What's the secret? I asked the kids, what's the secret? They said, oh, this school is like a family. We all support each other. We're in this together. School culture. One of those things we can't impose, but we know make a huge difference. I asked the teachers, what makes a school like this work? And I should tell you, a third of the teachers, they were new. A third. Every lesson is planned collectively, every day. No lesson is given in a classroom unless it's been vetted by a senior teacher. And I asked a new teacher, is this what, you do this every day? He said, yes, every day. He said, don't all teachers do this? He said, because I wouldn't know what I was doing if I had to teach it by myself, because I'm new. Well, that's what we have in most of our schools. We have teachers working in isolation. Right? And if you judge those teachers by the test scores who have not been well-trained, and I'll say this, we have great, I see Anna Marie, we have a great program here in teacher education, but we produce good novices. That's what we produce, right? What are we doing to support our teachers when they get into schools to make sure they have a chance to be effective? When we look at the schools that get better results, they have different strategies. One of the things they're focused on is not on achievement, they're focused on engagement. Think about the difference. Think about the difference. I was trying to explain that, look at Culver City High School. I live in Culver City now. Culver City's got a greater percentage of African American Latino kids in AP courses and passing them. I told the report, is that the time? No. I told the reporter, I said, go look at Culver City. Why don't we do more what Culver City does? You know what the principal told me when we toured the school about why they get such a result? He said, we focus on keeping kids engaged. Achievement is the outcome. Engagement is the way to get there. If you wanted to lose weight, would you focus on the scale? Or would you focus on diet and exercise? We've got the schools focused on the scale. And they miss out how you get there. What do you got to do? And when you look at engagement, you realize it's behavioral, Right? Kids have to know what it takes to be prepared. They're organized. This is what AVID does so well, but it's also cognitive, right? And it is emotional. We got to get kids to care about learning. What's the strategy to get kids to care, to get kids to be motivated? I go to most schools, they don't have a strategy like that. They look at me dumbfounded. We need a strategy to get kids motivated? As if they can do it without the kids. When we get teachers focused on evidence of learning, they teach differently. When you get teachers analyzing work together, when they make the expectations clear and explicit, when they model and expose kids to good quality work, say this is what it looks like when you do it well. When we utilize diagnostic tools to make sure they understand, and we're constantly asking for their feedback, because teaching and learning art should be interactive. When we learn about their interests to make it relevant and meaningful. When we require kids to revise and resubmit. I can't tell you, you want to teach grit? Treat every assignment as a first draft. I don't do my best work on the first draft. The real learning is in the revision, sometimes multiple revisions, and the real teaching is not in the grading, but in the feedback. When you take the feedback from the kids and you get teachers together on a regular basis analyzing student work, you know what's supposed to happen? Teachers start to see teaching and learning as very related, and the best teachers become a resource for their colleagues. That's what we should be after. So we need to align the skills of the teachers with the needs of the kids. That's what it takes to start closing the gap. How's that sound for simple? That's what they did in Brockton. They aligned the skills of the teachers with the needs of the kids. They didn't sit around blaming middle school. They could have done that, right? Said, these middle schools are telling us kids who can't read. They said, no, we're going to meet them where they are. Align PD to student needs. Differentiate professional development for teachers. Provide access to mentors in content areas. Provide access time for teachers to observe and get feedback, and provide them with time to collaborate with their colleagues. When we start to do these things, what happens is we see outcomes change. We need a different vision. He's not sure what I said, but I'll say it again. We need a different vision. A different vision for education that's more holistic, that does connect things like extended learning time. There's a 6,000-hour gap in learning between middle-class kids and poor kids. What do the poor kids do in the summer? What do the middle-class kids do in the summer? Let's close that gap. What about after school? How many of you who have kids are spending your time after school driving all around town, right? To gymnastics, to all kinds of things. Especially if you live in LA, that's a big job. You might have to hire someone for that job, right? What are the other kids getting? We need to, engage the families. Think about health and safety. Think about mentorship. You know what the research shows? Kids who have an incarcerated parent, their graduation rate's so low. How many incarcerated people do we have in California? A whole lot. Let's come up with some new ways of measuring data. Well, how about some impact data? If you graduate kids who are in foster care, who are migrant workers, who are homeless, you're going to get some extra credit. And if you only serve wealthy kids, we're going to give you less credit because they're supposed to do well. That'd be like if UCLA Medical School said, you know, we're really good with healthy people. That's the only ones we serve are the healthy ones. Don't send us the sick ones because we're a really good hospital. Right now, we confuse serving privileged people with being good. Right? Let's look at the places where we're really adding value, where we're really having impact, shine the light on them. Guess what will happen? We'll make a lot more progress than we are now. Thank you.
So thank you, Pedro. Now it's time for first our conversation and then our broader conversation. So Debra, I'm going to start with you and say, what do you think? Are there areas that you think Pedro mentioned that need to be underscored, things you disagree with, or just give us a general reaction?
Every time I hear Dr. Noguera speak, I'm always impressed by what he has to say, and I think he's right on point. We have a serious problem here with equity. And you look at the students that we're serving through Los Angeles County, and you look at the achievement gap, and it's very, very, very clear that there's a problem in terms of how we're approaching the students that we're serving. In my work at LAUSD, where I served for 20 years, one of the things that I found that we really needed to do immediately was more assessing of students' needs. And me, coming from a social work background, really felt that we needed to assess for trauma. We needed to understand that when we did that, 60% of our 9th graders identified as experiencing trauma, either witnessing or directly being a victim of hitting, kicking, witnessing a killing or shooting. So one thing that we really need to do, as he mentioned, is we need to start where our children are at. And we need to make sure that we are addressing their education in a way that they're going to be able to access it. When you have students who are experiencing trauma in their home or in their community, and they come to school the next day, you take a student whose father just beat up her mother. The whole family was disrupted. Nobody slept the night before. The father was arrested. The mother was taken to the hospital. And then you have a student sitting in a classroom trying to learn. If we're not aware of some of the issues that our students are facing, I don't care how good the instruction is, I don't care how great the teacher is, that student's not going to be able to learn. So one, I think we have to do a lot more work assessing for trauma, given the fact that we know that so many of our children have been either the victims of trauma or have witnessed it. The other thing that we need to do is we need to focus, my belief is early intervention. We cannot wait until children are in middle school and high school as we keep passing them along to do something about the issues that they're facing. We need to identify them at birth, really. We need to work with families and engage them, but make sure that children are ready and prepared to come to school. In the county, we operate the largest Head Start program in the whole state. And part of that program is making sure that we're working with parents and that we're engaging them and we're helping them to understand what the educational system is like and how they can do the best that they can as parents to make sure that their children have access to education. My parents immigrated here from Mexico, and they had no idea and didn't understand the education system here. And as a result of that, 4 out of 5 of their children, including myself, dropped out of high school to go to work because our parents didn't understand how to access the educational system. And it's not that we didn't have the potential. All of us actually ended up going back to school once we realized how difficult it was to survive out there without an education. But parents need to be engaged. And one of the things that Pedro said that really stood out to me is that we have to look at what our children's needs are. And what I find oftentimes as educators and all of the other people that are making decisions about how to support children and families is we think we know what's best, rather than really talking to those families and talking to those students and finding out what types of support they actually need. And my father used to tell me, he said, it's almost like when people come and they try to help you, and it's like when you have an itch. Like if you have a really bad itch, and if you can imagine that, and then somebody comes and they want to help, but they scratch in the wrong place. You know, it's like we need to understand, we need to talk to our families, we need to engage them, we need to talk to our students, and we need to find out what it is they want, and we need to do it as early as possible. The other thing that I think is very critical is focusing on student attendance very early on. One of the things that I found out working in LAUSD, I was responsible for attendance, so I really wanted to understand it. I looked at it in every way possible. I looked at it by student attendance, by grade, by ethnicity, by disability, by language, any way that you can look at it, looking for patterns in attendance. And what I found out is that our kindergartners, our youngest children, had the worst attendance than any other grade. You know, you would expect the high school students that are ditching and that are taking off, but it was actually our kindergartners that had the worst attendance. So it's really needing to take a look at that. In addition to that, breaking it down by race, I found that our African American students had double the rate of chronic absenteeism in kindergarten than some of our other students. So looking at that and then saying, what is wrong with that? What is wrong with our system that is failing to meet the needs of these students, that they're not coming to school regularly? Do they feel safe at school? Do they feel welcomed at school? Do they feel like they're valued at school? Do their parents feel like their child is going to get a good education at school? Or what are some of the other community issues that are preventing those children from coming to school? Parents who don't have access to a car to get them to school. Parents who are working different jobs and they're having a difficult time about who's going to even get the child up and get them to school. Lack of medical care or medical insurance. So many things that we need to look at in terms of making sure that our youngest children are able to come to school, that we're looking at data to decide what type of programs we're going to implement, and that we're making sure we're talking to our students and our families to ensure that those programs that we're implementing are the programs that they think are going to work.
Thank you. And Jim, let me pose it to you. How do you scale up this, this enterprise? I don't think I heard Pedro mention technology once. I associate you with technology. So how do you react?
I'll take it. I'll start with this, which is that Pedro put the core issue at the center of the table, right? The question for us is, how do, when you take that little chart I had up there about impact versus scale, scale basically means how do you reach everybody? How does everybody get a fantastic educational outcome? How does everybody get a fantastic educational How does everybody get a fantastic educational outcome? Excuse the outburst. And so it's really interesting. People associate, for good reason, Mark and Priscilla, with personalized learning. I guess something that has become a part of the conversation a lot today around education. And so my thing was, fantastic. You cannot talk about personalized learning without starting the conversation about the status of the learner. What is the physical, emotional, mental status of the learner? What are their needs and how are they being addressed? And how are the systems organized to meet those needs? Every intervention can't meet all of the needs. Many of them can be accommodated though. But the systems for the learning environments that we're creating, schools, should ensure that they are attentive to those needs. And then you can figure out what you do on top. You heard Pedro talking about the teachers, the schools are meeting the kids where they are. Like, differentiation is what you do when you can't get to the individual kid level, right? It is how you aggregate, what you're trying to do is meet every single kid. What you can do is meet groups of kids, but the question is, how do we meet them all? And get them to the same level of outcomes. So I want to spend just a couple minutes talking about some of the things that Pedro pointed out. How does technology fit in? Data. Data. How do you know what those needs are? How do we more efficiently find out those needs? Why is it so hard to get those immunization records? Why is it so costly to get the diagnostic assessments done to figure out whether there are delays? Why isn't it universal? Like, those are pretty simple questions. Imagine if we had low-cost universal diagnostics for the most common physical, emotional, and mental issues preventing kids from learning. What if every kid got it, that data was easily captured and accessible in ways that were appropriately private to the school and the other actors in their lives? What if the basic organization put the student at the center, using that data, using the basic constructs of social networks as they operate today to keep people organized around that child and their outcomes. What if the early warning systems weren't things that happened quarterly but could happen daily? Because the triggering events, the leading indicators of the things that send kids off track, guess what? We're finding more and more and more that you can find them earlier and earlier and earlier. So we need to think about how to take the things that are really, really hard, that we ask people to work miracles to do today, and make them much more accessible, much easier, much more low cost, and frankly, more precise. Next, assessments. Our assessment system is horribly broken. Sorry, it is. Now, I don't know if folks remember the assessment RFP that came out when they first put out the assessment RFP around when the Common Core came out. It was actually pretty progressive. It asked for the ability to come up with a summative view from formative assessment over time, lots and lots of different things. The folks who make our tests right now said, we can't get there from here, right? So the question for us is, how do we craft assessments that give us the information we need, that are not cumbersome and overbearing, that are embedded in the work, that are informative to the student and also informative to the teacher, but also give us a systemic view of how we're doing? Is this an individual student issue? Is this a teacher professional development issue? Is it a problem with the curriculum? Is it some other problem that we haven't diagnosed? We have to have assessments. We have to have data. We have to have ways for comparison so we can tell what's working and what's not for whom. The question is, how do we do it? And we keep talking about whether. It's about how. So embedded in all of this is the need for more of what I talked about. At the micro level and at the macro level, we need to be figuring out what works and how to get it to scale, whether from classroom to classroom, or school to school, district to district, state to state. We suck at all of that. You just do. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. So I would love to continue our conversation, but in the interest of time, let me open it up to the group for questions. At the back.
Thank you for your comments, Pedro, especially Jim. Your comments on standards really resonate. My company is building assessments to take down the SAT, SAT2s, and APs. And I say not trying, but actually building, because we will. But I think the question comes less so in that the standards around the Common Core are unreasonable, and more so in how do you actually, to Jim's point, assess the things that matter. And in the interim, while we're getting there and achieving adoption, how do you make sure that everyone else working on education reform and K through 12 is focused on teaching more of what matters instead of more of what doesn't? Because right now, everything that should look like progress looks like regress. So how do you start to bridge that gap on a local, a state, and a federal level? Because what's really driving the end goal still seems to be college. And what happens at the college level is Harvard sneezes and the other elite schools catch a cold. And then the top high schools get sick, and then the whole system is infected. So how do you bridge the gap between the standard setting that happens between PCS and the cartel and elite colleges and the rest of the governance system?
What do you really think? And a response from anyone?
Who wants to go first?
All I say is I see, as I look around the country, Virginia, to me, has the most interesting strategies going on right now. Right now, there's coming from State Department of Education, an effort to promote performance-based assessment. But rather than imposing that on districts, they're waiting for the districts to say, we're ready to try. And they are getting some districts that are ready. And what they're seeing already is what we've seen in New York, where 36 schools have been doing performance-based assessment for a very long time now. kids much more likely to graduate, less likely to be in remedial courses, much more likely to persist. So we're getting good evidence that there is another way. Now the question is, to Jim's point, how do you take it to scale, right? And how do you do it in places where the capacity is weak? That, I think, is a real challenge, because every state department of education in the country is organized for compliance, not to help schools. That's the fundamental problem we face across, one of them, across America today.
And on that last point, what I'll say, and it's only gotten worse because the budgets have been cut so thin. But the other part is there needs to be, I hate to say a conversation, but there needs to be an important conversation about broadening the definition of success. And what winds up happening, was described earlier by Pedro, is in the preschools, is that wealthy people are able to choose the option that actually pursues that broader definition of success, right? You look for a school that's going to tend to all those other things besides the fact that they just are going to learn to read and compute. And because you have resources, you can buy it. Inherently, we all know it's important. But we've allowed our policies and our inadequate systems of assessment to say, we're going to stick with these things over here because we can measure those quickly and easy with things that have bubbles, right? So, again, all of these things are things where the questions are becoming more and more clear. Our patience for waiting for the answers and creating space for people to try things that work and don't work and not be penalized is very, very little. But if we have to create that space, and then more and more, I think you're going to see institutions responding to what was said earlier, which is the employers. And the employers are really clear about what they want. So I'm seeing that shift start to happen.
I feel like I need to jump in here, and then I'll move to you. I think part of the problem, although I certainly would never want to speak against innovation in assessment, but part of the problem is a perception problem. Teachers in schools feel like they need to choose between helping kids do well on the test and doing what they think is right for kids. But we have lots of examples of doing right by kids, in fact, shows up on these assessments that we are not exactly getting at everything we want them to get at. So there isn't that terrible choice that schools have to make. But we need to do a better job of both developing the evidence and communicating the evidence so that people will know that moving to deeper learning, you're not sacrificing test scores. In fact, your test scores probably will get better because we basically know that test preparation only works to a certain point and then flattens out. Over here, please.
Thank you. I recently moved back to the United States from Germany. I've been there since 2006, and I moved here back in March of this year, March 15th. And I have to say, when I left here, I was a teacher. I've been teaching since 1996. As you gave those dismal statistics earlier, it's what I have heard every year before I left. In Germany, I met a German, we got married, we have a child now, and now I'm back here with a child instead of just being a teacher. I'm getting to my point. We were in a school here in LAUSD. We put our son here because he's now 6. He will start school here in Germany. They don't start until they turn 6, and we left before he started. We put him in Goethe International School here. That's very close to Culver City, but it's LAUSD. And it's an IB program there. It's a bilingual program for German and English-speaking students, and it was really great. It was excellent. Carl was highly engaged, and he could speak in his first language, which is German. But it was very far from us, very, very far from where we lived. And we decided to put him where we live, in a public school, because we felt it was just too long for us to travel there to get him there, but we were very sorry. Now, in the school he's at now, it really is what Pedro was describing. I mean, they learn rote memory
things. We are so shocked at what comes home as homework. He finishes his math homework in 15 to 20 minutes because it's so easy. He has to learn rote vocabulary words. The principal of the school called me in last week and said, look, we think your son is too smart to come here. We think you should put him in a Montessori school where he's learning everything. It was amazing. You were reading my email, so to speak, as you gave your presentation. We are now looking at a Montessori school, and we feel we have to take on extra jobs now because the school is not servicing our son, who is a middle-class child. Please just comment.
You know, here's one of the ironies. Montessori was founded by Maria Montessori in the ghettos of Rome for the poorest children. Why has it become almost exclusively available to affluent children in this country? Right? You raise so many questions. The fact that the school says they couldn't serve your child is such an indication of what's wrong. Right? I mean, they should be so happy to have you and your child, to have a parent who is support, but it's a reflection of the fact that these disparities that I started speaking about show up in the learning opportunities. And that's the issue we haven't addressed. And sadly, many of the educators themselves don't even realize how they're complicit in perpetuating those inequities.
So just really quickly, I'll say that is why the first question is, what do you believe? The first question is always, what do you believe? Because to say that about your child says whether they know it or not, they don't believe that about any of the children that are there. They don't believe that any of the children that are there have that potential. And how many 3-year-olds have you ever met that you didn't think were a genius? I mean, think about it. You meet genius 3-year-olds all the time, and then somehow we lose them all. I'm sorry.
One last question at the back. Heidi?
Thank you. Hello, everybody. My name is Heidi, and I come from Finland. Oh, my gosh. Yeah, and we are, Dylan, even crazier than the Canadians. I speak 8 languages.
Wow.
Yeah. Thank you to the Finnish education system. But anyway, I was thinking a lot of things that you have said today here start me to think about the teacher education. And I was thinking, what if you had teachers, you, Joan, said about that the teachers that you need to interpret to teachers different test scores, and what does it really mean? What if you would have teachers that know how to look at different test scores and what to look at when they see the PISA assessment results and so on? What if you had teachers that said, no, it's always my responsibility if the child is left behind?
I think if we to move in that direction, we'd have to make sure that the teacher was much more skilled than she or he is right now in order to be able to make wise decisions about how to serve the needs of a child. I'll give you an example, because Jim made the point about what we need better data, and I agree, but I think that we're asking the wrong questions about data. I was sitting with another county superintendent 2 weeks ago, and she was looking at the data of students in the corrections facilities. Now, this is a place where the teacher ratio to students is very low. It's like 1 teacher to 5 kids. And she's looking at the data. All the data says these kids are at the lowest level in achievement. She said, what do I do with this? I said, you don't have enough information about the kids. She said, what more should I know? I said, how many of those kids have mental illness? How many of those kids that you're serving should have an IEP? You don't know a lot of those things. How many of those are English learners? She said, wow. I said, yeah, you don't know that much about these kids, but you have they have a situation where they could, but they need a much more skilled teacher than they have right now, but they also need to ask different questions. If you only see what they can't do, then you ignore all the things they can do, and you're also ignoring their needs. And if we don't address the needs, we can't address the learning.
Yeah, I'd like to add to
Yeah, please.
I just want to say the other thing that is is important is that we start looking, as Pedro said, from moving away from a deficit lens to an asset lens. Because so many teachers and educators and other people serving students and certain communities see only the deficits and don't identify the tremendous strengths. And I also have in the county responsibility for the direct instruction for the kids who are incarcerated. And it's tragic. I was just at one of our camps yesterday. And you see these kids with so much potential and so much ability in a classroom where there's, as you said, there's one teacher, 2 probation officers, 2 TAs. I mean, there's more adults in the classroom than there are students. And when the students are engaged and when they have the right teacher who cares about them and understands them, it is amazing to see the learning that takes place. And it is so depressing to go in there and to see how we as a society have failed these children. Because it's not those children, it is our system that has failed them. To see so many children, and again, when you talk about the equity issue, anytime anybody want to go to a camp or hall and want to join me, please give me a call. They are all black and brown children. There's something wrong when we've taken such children with such great potential and see them in a situation where they're incarcerated. Some of them are there for life.
And how much are we spending per year on those kids? Last estimate was over $200,000 a year to incarcerate a kid in LA County. Wow.
We're spending a lot of money.
I'm not saying you are. But if you think of county resources.
Well, I'm afraid we're going to have to end the session on that depressing note, but I think it's certainly should fuel our conversation over the next 2 days. Thank you.